Lewis and Clark's Expedition Across America. Chapter 1. A Command from the President. In the waning light of a mild April afternoon in the year 1803, the scent of blooming dogwoods drifted through the newly cobbled streets of Washington City. The Potomac shimmered in the west as if chasing the last of the sun's warmth, while yellow light flickered in the tall paneled windows of the President's house. Inside, amidst gas lanterns casting golden shadows against whitewashed walls, President Thomas Jefferson hunched over a large, time-worn desk wrapped in oak and reverie. Before him lay a sea of maps, some delicate with age, others smudged from heavy use, splayed wide like the parchment wings of dreaming. But in their center, always the eye of his curiosity stretched to the great unknown, a vast, blank wilderness lurking beyond the Mississippi River. These were not lands entirely without story. Fur trappers spoke of forests that grew as thick as night and rivers that churned like the veins of the continent. Native nations had called them home long before ink ever dreamed of paper. Yet to Jefferson and his Enlightenment mind, such spaces pulsed with more than mystery. They brimmed with opportunity, with science, with the raw marrow of destiny. That spring, Jefferson's heart belonged not merely to the present, but pulsed forward with the rhythm of an unfolding nation. Just months earlier, in a maneuver that rewrote the map of a continent, he had struck a deal with the gaunt and brooding Emperor of France. For $15 million, less than 4 cents an acre, the Louisiana Territory had been ceded to the United States. Nearly 830,000 square miles of wilderness stretching from the Mississippi River to the peaks of the Rockies had changed hands on paper. But no pen could chart what no eye had seen. Jefferson wanted more than ownership. He craved understanding. Who lived there? What creatures, fierce or fleeting, prowled the plains? Were there mountains impassable, or rivers that poured west to the Pacific, offering a water route that might stitch the interior of America to the twin oceans of destiny? In the quiet moment between candle flickers, Jefferson's long fingers paused beside a brass compass. His mind, restless as ever, reached toward a name, and it came. Meriwether Lewis. Lewis, his personal secretary, had stood beside him for years, not merely as an aide, but as a reflection of the president's own precision. A man of structure and method, Lewis bore within him a curious blend, textbook science and soldier's metal. A Virginian, like Jefferson, tempered in service and cut from the cloth of order and valor. Once an army captain, he had an eye for the natural world and the restraint of a philosopher. Jefferson knew he would need a leader who could see beauty in moss and decode shape from chaos, a man who could navigate both the wilderness and the fragile egos of foreign tribes and his own weary men. And so, beneath the seal of the Republic, and amid the rising clamor of a young nation spilling toward its borders, Jefferson summoned Lewis. The letter of instructions, penned by Jefferson himself, became part scientific manifesto, part diplomatic primer, and part invocation of American hope. It outlined the boundaries of the mission: to explore the Missouri River and, if possible, find a water route across to the Pacific, to observe and document flora, fauna, geology, and celestial patterns, to befriend, if possible, the tribal nations encountered, and always to log, measure, and map. But beneath its ink, the message burned brighter than the page. Discover not just land, but identity. This was to be less a journey of conquest and more a pilgrimage of curiosity. With careful conviction, the president placed the weight of this dream into Lewis's stern and waking hands. From that moment, Lewis's world became motion, methodical, thunderous motion. He was granted authority, but not yet companions. For such a voyage, he needed not only hardy men, but kindred minds. And there was only one man who came to Lewis's mind with honest certainty: William Clark. Clark had once been Lewis's commanding officer during their days in the frontier army. A man of less formal learning but equal vision, Clark walked square-shouldered beneath the sky and seemed always to march with the earth's own rhythm. He sketched maps with dreamlike accuracy and saw rivers like others saw grammar, fluid, structured, and alive. Together they had forged a quiet brotherhood in battle, one born of fire pits, marching songs, and the heavy quiet of frontier nights. Lewis saw in Clark not only a co-captain, but the other half of their coming legend. Dispatches flew, letters swept north toward the Kentucky frontier, where Clark had settled into a quieter life. The response came, swift and sure, not penned in flourish, but tempered in iron: I will join you with cheerfulness. Their command was not equal in pay. Clark would technically serve beneath Lewis, but in heart and on record, Lewis insisted they be remembered as co-leaders, captain and captain. Dreamers in twin boots. From that point, the preparations began, with a fury known only to those who must chase the sun before it vanishes. Lewis traveled to Philadelphia. the intellectual heart of the Republic, where brick streets rang with steel wheels and chiming bells. There he met with botanists, surgeons, astronomers, and map-makers. He grilled them with scholar's fire, absorbing everything about medicinal herbs, waterborne diseases, mineral classifications, and the secrets of celestial navigation. He practiced treating snake bites and setting splints. He learned to dissect the stars above as a sailor reads his compass, each night sky a map written in fire. Provisions followed, tents of treated canvas, dozens of flintlock rifles, tomahawks, powdered medicines locked in tin, mirror tokens for gifts, gaily colored beads crafted to charm tribes, 20 pounds of ink and paper, copper kettles that could boil meat or carry messages in their echo. And always journals leather-bound, stitched tight, asking to be filled with words no one had yet imagined. Lewis had a special boat designed, a 55-foot keelboat with a tall central sail, a dozen oars, and a small cabin braced in timber. It would be their floating armory, their science lab, and message to all they encountered. We are not just passing through, we are discovering. Recruits were drawn from across the frontier. Some were hardened soldiers. Others were blacksmiths, scouts, or translators with tongues shaped by forests and trade. French fur trappers, Highlanders with scar-born faces. Even Clark's enslaved man, York, a towering figure whose presence would in time star in the oral traditions of entire tribal nations. York, though given no commission, moved as a pillar among the ranks. His tasks were many, but his legend would grow still larger. They gathered at Camp Wood near the Mississippi's thick breadth. The river curled there like a promise half-spoken. There the newly christened Corps of Discovery trained, paddling in cold mornings, lifting stores through mud-soaked trails, practicing signals and shots. And all the while journals bloomed with sketches, buckthorn plants, beaver teeth, strange-shaped animal tracks. Even before leaving, they were discovering. By the time the expedition was ready to set off in May of 1804, the Missouri itself seemed almost impatient to begin. The keelboat groaned against its mooring. Canoes bobbed like bones trying to remember muscle. And the men, mixture of conviction, anxiety, and sharpened dreams, stood with calloused hands and furrowed brows, their eyes pointed upstream. As the oars dipped into the water, casting rings that bled against the flow, few yet knew what lay ahead. Thunderstorms loomed. Disease prowled. Meetings with tribes would swing between sanctuary and slaughter. And mountains, unimaginable in their menace and grace, waited like sharpened wings along the horizon. Yet in that moment, in that solemn collective breath where their boat finally slipped into current, the cornfield crossed into something more than unknown geography. They entered a dream, sown by the minds of philosophers and planted by hands that now rode forward. And in every silent creak of leather, in every whispered prayer muttered against wood and water, a story began to unfold. A story not yet shaped by time, but destined, one stroke at a time, to carve itself across the very heart of America. Chapter 2. Into the Wilderness. Which is mortal of clay, then sinacitude Cyrus. Cannot yet the sin ingredients. The refiner will do the be. How much time with the yards? I know that the shades of the recorder is I'll not say. No river. Hires. Tracks of animals crisscrossed muddy banks. Elk and deer, sharp-hooved and wary, had fled before the noise of man-made paddles. Bears left crude hieroglyphs in the turned soil beneath elder trees. And once, when a fog unthreaded the morning light, John Shields and George Drouillard spotted something that sent whispered tales through the camp. A single paw print, wide as a man's face, sunk deep in wet clay. A grisly myth in flesh. Lewis and Clark documented everything. No petal escaped their notice, no songbird soared unrecorded. Their journals became altars, offered to the Enlightenment gods of knowledge and catalogue. Quills scratched against parchment as rust-haired squirrels leapt from bough to bough above them. Unknown species of lupinus, Lewis might write beside an accompanying sketch, clover-like buds in teal robe, pollinated by a bee of irregular shape. These observations were both work and wonder. They were also armor, a way to hold back fear with the order of science. But the wilderness was no patient subject. The river's current tugged against them with a near-conscious intent, as if resentful of intrusion. Men leaned hard into the oars, sometimes for hours without pause, shoulder to shoulder in blistered silence. The sun charred them during the day, chill dampness bit into their bones at night. Insects flew in dances of torment. Mosquitoes thrummed as clouds of fangs, crawling into tense hair and skin. Gnats swarmed eyes, mouths, and nostrils, their wings whispering shrill curses of endurance. Wassons tried various salves and mixtures sent by Philadelphia's botanists, vinegar, bear grease, mint, but nature laughed them off. Summer gave them no reprieve. It only tightened the belt. Their provisions, while meticulously planned, always eroded faster than anticipated. Flour molded, bacon soured, the salted pork sometimes carried riddles of worm or rot. Clark's slave, York, despite being burdened with more than most, often proved indispensable in foraging and hunting. He had a knack for locating edible roots and signs of game. When a deer was brought down, usually by Drouillard or Cruzat, the rare feast became a spiritual event. The fire would crackle into the cool dusk, meat sizzling over flames. The men gathered wordless with hunger and reverence, the stars blooming open above them like a scattered hymn. Still, not all nights were so generous. One evening, dark and windless, Private Charles Floyd collapsed mid-sentence. His face turned a ghastly hue, and he groaned a name none could understand. It haunted them. Lewis tended him through the night, sleepless, applying poultices and praying over tinctures, but the illness, perhaps a ruptured appendix or an abdominal infection, refused reason. Floyd died 2 days later, his death the first reminder that this was more than a voyage of science or state. They buried him on a high bluff overlooking the river. Clark carved a wooden cross, his knife trembling in his grip. "We must go on," Lewis had whispered that night, but fewer men slept soundly afterwards. From time to time the Corps encountered tribal camps, smoke on distant ridgelines, the flash of movement among trees, and always they approached with open palms, and Jefferson's vision of peace held out like a parchment shield. When they met the Ottawa and Missouri peoples, it was beneath a canopy of poplars just beginning to show hints of gold. The Corps performed a military ceremony, flags lifted, rifles gleaming, uniforms trimmed and brushed. Clark, with his tall and commanding bearing, spoke bluntly through interpreters. Lewis, more gentle, inquired after the land, the rivers, the people's stories. The Ottawa were curious. They examined the white men's compasses and quizzed them about the stars. The explorers gave gifts, metal coins engraved with Jefferson's likeness, mirrors, brass buttons, and tobacco rolls bundled in ribbon. In return, they received a hesitant welcome and advice about the terrain ahead. Despite this exchange of culture and courtesy, unease lingered. The native people saw through Jefferson's dreams quicker than the Corps would admit. There was something veiled in these Easterners, the weight of something coming. Not long after, the Corps struck unexpected hardship. A summer storm brewed with a swiftness that tasted unnatural. The sky, once an endless bowl of blue, folded into itself as black clouds split the heavens like a curtain torn by gods. Rain pelted their boats, and lightning cracked against river stone. The keelboat heaved like a wounded ox. One of the smaller pirogues capsized near a twisted snag of willow limbs, and it took 3 men and near 2 hours to heave it out, waterlogged and robbed of sacks containing tools and a precious compass. They lost days along that flooded stretch, waiting for calmer waters and drying linen maps under strained canvas. Alexander Willard, a blacksmith and one of their strongest men, nearly drowned, saved at the last breath when Clark dove in with a rope, anchoring himself against the river like an oak against a storm. That night, fires shivered across the banks, and the men huddled close, speaking little. The rain held back, but only just. Into the deeper parts of the land they pressed, where the grass grew so tall it swallowed the legs of elk and horses alike, and thorny scrub rose in labyrinthine walls. On one overcast morning, Lewis paused the procession near a wide plain dotted with black cone-shaped mounds. Prairie dogs, the journals would record, but more than a curiosity. They were an emblem of the untamed world ahead. Thousands of them, squealing and barking from their tunneled homes, scattered like embers when the explorers approached. The men caught one, with Lewis dedicating great effort to ship the little creature alive back to Washington. "The President will enjoy it," he said with a rare smile. But even this act, light-hearted on the surface, held something deeper, a note about taming the West by cataloging its marvels, one tiny beast at a time. Every mile inland took a toll. The men were no longer merely military instruments or carriers of Jefferson's wishes. Something was changing in them. Their muscles carried new language. Their hearts beat not in rhythm with the cities they had left, but with the rustling breath of wolves. They had seen how the moon silvered the river into a twin world. They had felt hunger that scorched dignity to ash. They had learned to listen, truly listen, to the wind and what it carried. Some began to dream more vividly of great birds speaking in unknown languages, of women made of starlight leading them along winding trails, of ancient bison skulls flickering with fire from within. They woke to sweat and silence. Were they visions of madness, or simply the land climbing inside their minds? Bit by bit, it became harder to write it all down, and yet the work of exploration demanded it. Sketches continued, notes passed between Lewis and Clark, each adding details to maps that no hand had ever inked before. Shadows and symbols shaped the story of the West even before the people of the East could imagine it. As they rounded a bend marked by serpentine cliffs of sandstone streaked with red ochre, Lewis spotted eagle nests high in a pallet of twisted cottonwoods. "We must be near a story," he wrote, "and if the land held stories, then it held danger too." One day, venturing upriver to scout ahead with a small detachment, Lewis returned troubled that smoke had risen on a ridge nearby from an unmarked camp, the embers still warm when he arrived. No signs of horses, no refuse, just absence. The silence had weight. He offered no orders to investigate further. Instead, he wrote by firelight that night, "What moves around us, unseen? Perhaps watches. We must remember we are not first visitors, and likely not the last. Survival, purpose, awe, these would become the constellations by which they would steer. Not the North Star nor Polaris alone, but the fixed compass points buried deeply in their bones." For this land, the vast unknown, was not a blank space on a map anymore. It was a breathing, sentient thing that required reverence. Chapter 3. The Teton Warning. Beneath the vast, wheeling sky of September, the rolling prairies were a sea of ochre and rustling golden grass, swept by winds that whispered of things both ancient and unseen. The river, winding languidly through the heartland, seemed a silver serpent coiled between banks of earth as the Corps of Discovery approached the lands of the Teton Sioux. At first, nothing but the silent watchfulness of nature marked their passage. Pronghorn danced in distant silhouettes, buffalo herds roamed like moving hills, and eagles traced invisible sigils in the clouds. But then came signs discernible only to those honed by wilderness. A feather lashed to a tree limb, a carving in the soft bark, smoke curling from beyond a low rise. Lewis and Clark knew. Others were near. The Teton were watching. They made camp at a bend in the river, fortified their boats, and arranged their cargo with precision. While the men busied themselves with firewood and hunting, tension grew like a distant drum. The air was still, but it held weight. The Mississippi had receded far behind them. They were deep now in lands where sovereignty no longer belonged to the United States, where spoken words could veil death or offer safe passage. 2 days later, the Sioux made themselves known, suddenly and with ceremony. Their canoes glided across the water like shadows stitched of sinew and silence, guided by strong arms and faces that carved no shape of expression. The captains counted nearly 50 warriors before the boats even touched the sand. They came bearing spears, bows, and painted faces, eyes like polished obsidian, reflecting both curiosity and dominance. At their head walked Chief Black Buffalo, his frame tall, robes heavy with quill work and bone. Close beside him were 2 sub-chiefs, Buffalo Medicine and the youthful but sharp-eyed Truth-Teller. They only spoke through look and stance, until the interpreter, Pierre Dorion, a wiry man with mountain-born instincts and forked familiarity with tribal cadence, stepped forward with deliberately slow words. The initial greetings were thick with status, deference, and hidden testing. To shake hands was not merely to greet, it was to agree on invisible terms. The captains offered medals embossed with Jefferson's profile, beads, pipe tobacco, and bolts of cloth. These gifts were acknowledged not with delight, but with the solemn judgment of rulers themselves. The Sioux accepted them not as offerings of superiority, but equivalency, or perhaps submission. A council was arranged for the following day. That evening, in a clearing beside the river, a great lodge was erected by the Sioux of painted hides and set with cedar boughs. There the Corps was invited to enter, not as masters of ceremony, but guests at the mercy of ancient protocol. The banquet laid before them was rich beyond expectation: roast buffalo, wild rice, and smoked fish that carried the scent of distant northern lakes. Dancers circled with feathered headdresses, and the drumbeat echoed like a heart against their chests. Yet even as the fragrance of food rose and music filled the air, there was an edge beneath every word, and stares as keen as blades. William Clark sipped from the shared buffalo horn cup, his hand never far from his belt pistol. Lewis, always the scholar, kept time by observing, measuring each laugh, each nod, each silence. Midway through the evening, Chief Black Buffalo turned from host to sovereign. His voice quieted the dancers. Through Dorion, he demanded tribute, one of the great keel boats. His reasoning was wrapped in honor and recognition. He claimed to offer protection on behalf of his people, guarding the traveler's progress in exchange for such a fine vessel. But no one in the room failed to understand the real meaning. Surrender part of your power, and we will let you pass. Lewis's spine tensed. His eyes flicked to Clark, who had already narrowed his gaze and slowly tilted his chair forward. The firelight danced on his copper-flecked hair as he spoke low to Dorion. "Tell them the boats are not ours to give." Dorion hesitated only briefly, then translated. The tension swelled like a drawn bow. The Sioux murmured among themselves. A few hands rested on knife pommels. One warrior rose halfway, only to be pulled quietly back down by another. Behind the captains, their men stood at attention, unspeaking but prepared. 15 rifles hidden behind rough smiles. Then Lewis spoke, his voice calm, steady as riverstone. He made no apology, no threat. He talked of peace, of President Jefferson's hope for alliance, of trade routes and shared future prosperity. But he offered no boat. Black Buffalo's eyes flicked from Dorion to Lewis, then slowly to the fire. At that precipice of diplomacy and doom, Pierre Dorion produced the sacred pipe. Slowly, deliberately, he packed the bowl with fine tobacco imported from the east. Black Buffalo accepted it, added his own pinch dried red willow bark from the western plains, and lit it from the ceremonial flame. He inhaled deeply and passed it to Lewis, who mirrored the solemn gesture. The fire between them crackled, no longer a threat, but an agent of understanding. All knew what had passed. War had hovered, but bowed its head and moved on. For now. That night, no one slept deeply. Clark sat outside his tent under stars so sharp they seemed dangerous. He polished his musket by moonlight. Beside him, York kept a vigilant watch, his enormous figure silhouetted like a monument carved of muscle and memory. The river offered no comfort, just the low wash of water on distant rocks. 2 days later, the Corps was allowed to depart. Horses watched them from ridgelines, and painted warriors escorted them for miles before quietly disappearing into the prairie. But something had shifted. Lewis felt it in the crease of his brow whenever he looked behind. The strangers they had greeted with gifts had tested more than inspiration. They had taken the measure of white ambition. From here on, the Corps would not only be explorers, but agents of empire, symbols of something large and hungry. A new awareness settled in the men. No longer did they see native tribes as points on Jefferson's diplomatic ledger. Now, each new encounter would be approached with equal parts reverence and wariness, for any people strong enough to harvest buffalo on these plains could surely harvest blood if crossed. They pressed on upriver, past ghost towns of prairie dog burrows, through reed-choked waters, over long days of hard rowing against currents that seemed angry and wrong. They saw more tribes, Yanktonai, Arikara, but the memory of the Tetons lingered like frost that wouldn't melt. Around each campfire, whispers crept like fog. What if we had given the boat? What if they had attacked? But none could answer what might have been, only what waited. Still, even amid the aftershock of confrontation, persisted the quiet work of science and wonder. Lewis documented a new species, an agile hare with enormous ears capable of detecting the footstep of wolves. Clark sketched distant geological ridges veined red and black like the marbled books they had left behind in Philadelphia. The wind scattered seeds, unfamiliar and fragrant, and sometimes, in the wake of tension, the wilderness gave unexpected gifts. One morning, just before sunrise, a great herd of elk crossed the shallow water near camp. Their antlers held morning dew and glistened like frost in lantern glow. The men stared in silence, rifles untextured. For a few perfect minutes, the expedition was not mission or message, but witness-privileged observers in a land unscripted by white fable. Yet always the political thread persisted. Lewis began to write more cautiously in his journals, noting not only flora and fauna, but growing resistance. He marked encounters with sentences folded carefully, as much for future scholars as for wary lawmakers. The West was no blank canvas, he knew. It was a tapestry already woven, with strands too complex and sacred to simply overwrite. Even the men, grizzled and tightened by labor, grew more aware. John Ordway wrote one night in his journal, scrawling by the light of a tallow candle, "The Sioux have eyes that look into our souls. I think many of us would rather face thunder than those eyes again." The keel boats passed into narrower waters. The winds shifted colder, and in the wake of diplomacy barely held, and a warning that had arrived not as words but as ritual, the core of discovery moved forward, farther upriver, farther into the uncertain places where even maps held their breath. Chapter 4. the Bitterroot gates. The river had grown thin, not just in depth, but in voice. It no longer thundered with power, nor urged the boats forward with insistent currents. Now it whispered in trickles, breaking over stone and root, as the great veins of the Missouri splintered into tributaries, and beyond them nothing but raw wilderness and towering forms on the horizon. The Rocky Mountains, stretching like the spine of the continent, rose into view, their blue-gray silhouettes distant yet formidable, like frozen gods with snow-burnished shoulders cloaked in cloud. The men of the Corps, hardened by months of rowing, foraging, and negotiation, now felt the weight of a far greater adversary: elevation. The prairies behind them had offered fierce storms, but also bounty, rivers bulging with catfish, land riddled with deer trails, and people who, though often wary, had opened their fires and baskets to strangers. Here, the landscape gave little. Pine forests stood like sentinels of silence, and the wind, once warm and full of life, had turned sharper, whistling with an alpine song foreign to the Flatlanders' ears. Their boots now met stone rather than soil. They could no longer row, they had to climb. Day after day they hauled gear through rising hills swaddled in fog, sometimes using pack horses, sometimes their own backs. Clark's journals were dotted now with references less botanical than existential. Heavy burdened forest, nearly impassable poor spirits. Even Lewis, usually clinical, wrote of a loneliness in the trees that I find difficult to name. But amid this harrowing terrain, a new figure stepped quietly into the narrative. Her name was Sacagawea. Though already a part of the expedition, since her husband Toussaint Charbonneau, the French-Canadian interpreter and trader, had joined them months earlier, her presence had until now remained quiet, even spectral. She spoke rarely. She tucked her child, little Jean-Baptiste, against her chest in a cradleboard wrapped in fur. But in these mountains her quiet feet knew paths unmarked on any map, and her memory, half dream, half blood, became their guide through a world few outsiders had ever seen. She had been born among the Shoshone of the Lemhi Valley before being kidnapped by Hidatsa raiders at a young age, and though years and forced marriages had pulled her east, pieces of her homeland had never left her. The smell of spruce bark, the way snow gathers on rock ledges, the almost imperceptible curve of slope that foretold a pass ahead. She walked the ridges calmly, flicking her eyes across flora like a painter selecting pigments. She recognized where the chokecherries grew thick, where the marrow-rich roots of camas hid like treasure. She taught the men which berries could numb their tongues and which could nourish them for days. Often they watched in awe as she whispered in their direction, stepping off the trail to dig with sure hands. The mountains might well have defeated the Corps of Discovery, for the cold came earlier here, the nights fell faster, and wild game was scarce. But they had a savior in Sacagawea. Lewis, for all his learning, could not have foreseen this. He had studied anatomy, astronomy, medicine, yet nothing in his volumes prepared him for how crucial one teenage woman, forgotten in the reckoning of nations, would be to the fate of his mission. She did not command men, she calmed them. She did not shout orders, she showed by quiet example how to survive. Still, survival was no guarantee. Their traverse brought them face to face with winter in ascension. A sudden storm buried the trail in snow, and they had not yet reached the crest of the Bitterroot Range. Trees groaned under the weight. The men spoke less, jokes diminished, rations ran low. Game trails led only to silence. The deer had gone downward, the elk scattered. Every breath steamed white in the morning. Firewood smoked more than it warmed. Even Sacagawea began to show signs of strain. Her lips chapped, her steps slower. Young Jean-Baptiste no longer cooed. He grew feverish one night, and even Clark, who had become fond of the boy and wrote of him often, feared he might perish in this place of ghosts and gloom. But then, almost miraculously, the mountains yielded a secret. Sacagawea recognized a certain twist in the land as they crested a minor pass, and her hands trembled as she halted. She turned eastward and said, for the first time that day, that she knew where they were. Her people were near. No one cheered. There was not the strength, but hope suddenly burned anew. A few days' march down into a warmer basin brought bear grass and the smoke sign of a Shoshone encampment. The hope and dread of that moment collided in everyone's eyes. What would these reclusive mountain people make of weather-beaten outsiders with odd tongues and strange tools? But fortune, it seemed, rode with them still. When the Corps faced the gathered Shoshone, Sacagawea stepped forward, breath visible in the cold air, and introduced herself to the chief, a tall man with a narrow face, knife scars down his forearms, and eyes like polished onyx. A silence fell when she spoke his name. More silence when he spoke hers. He was Kameya White, her brother. The moment was too big for the air. What had been statistics in planning, setbacks in journals, fears spoken low after dark were now rewritten by coincidence so profound it seemed orchestrated by the land itself. A woman stolen in girlhood had returned to her people over mountains that should have buried them, with a child on her back and strangers at her side. In many histories, such detail is whispered only as a coincidence, but in this alpine clearing it became the salvation of the Corps. Kameya White's people, cautious at first, opened their stocks. Roots were unpacked, bows and arrows shone with pride, fish were roasted in piney fire pits, smoke mingled with laughter, tent poles propped with elk hide. The men of the expedition ate their fill. The bitterness of the past weeks fell away like sleet melting from a cloak. New translations flowed not only in words, but in meals, glances, and the gentle bartering of gesture. Sacagawea sat with her brother beneath the stars, the sound of her native language falling from her mouth like a song not sung since childhood. And the men watched, worn, gnarled adventurers, listening to music whose meaning they could not grasp, but whose weight they understood completely. With Kameya White's help, the Corps secured horses to cross the remaining mountain passes. Without river to follow, they would now trek, relying on hooves, muscle, and what remained of faith. But even as the expedition moved onward, higher into the passes of the Bitterroot, the land reminded them constantly the price of passage was humility. Several times they found themselves trapped in hidden dales where snow fell sideways, and the air itself seemed to fight their breath. More than once, a pack horse slipped loose and tumbled down ravines. Fires sputtered in the altitudes. Sleep became fragmentary. Men shivered through long nights, wrapped in damp blankets, dreaming of hot meals and green fields they hadn't seen in months. That Kalarg took increasingly detailed notes on elevation and tree lines, studying each trail fork as if deciphering lines of ancient code. Lewis, meanwhile, grew more introspective, writing essays to himself, speculating on the geological age of the rocks he passed, marveling at the deep blues of glaciers tucked into bowls no map had ever recorded, but always they moved forward. What had begun as a government-sanctioned expedition, pragmatic, measured, military, had now evolved into something else entirely. The land had peeled them back, layer by layer, stripping comfort, revealing character. And deeply embedded in their progress through the Bitterroot Range was a truth few among them dared speak, that they had crossed a threshold not just of topography, but of soul. Many would return from this journey. Some would gain medals. Some towns would bear their names. But only here, in the brittle cathedral of snow-choked slopes and silence, had the transformation truly taken place. Where rivers ended and the mountains began, the heart of the journey beat loudest, and it spoke not only in English, nor French, nor even the tones of Shoshone, but in the timeless voice of moving feet and enduring will. And Chapter 5. Into the Pacific Fog. The descent from the towering Rockies was not a release, but a reshaping. The mountains did not so much weaken as metamorphose, changing from sheathed granite ramparts into sloped vales where mist curled like whispered secrets along the forest floor. Snowmelt surged into streams, and these swelled into the sinuous braid that would become the mighty Columbia River, a river native tongues called Nchaiwana, and which legends whispered would ultimately spill into an endless western sea. The men of the Corps of Discovery, once hardened to the dry trials of the plains and the crushing climbs of snowy passes, found themselves now in a land where water ruled. It roared, crept, pooled, and sometimes swallowed. It birthed fog each dawn, a velvet yet blinding shroud that turned every morning into a riddle. Trees no longer stood in patient prairie lines, but loomed now, moss-draped and silent, rising like ancient gods out of the gloom. Pines thick with damp needles leaned overhead, filtering light into shifting green cathedrals. Hope surged within the men, for the river flowed westward, west, that hallowed direction where President Jefferson believed the passage to wealth, trade, expansion, and the undefined glory of a young nation lay. But the river, like fate, was no straight road. Rapids bucked along its spine, cliffs jutted with slick malevolence over their heads, and stony shoals snapped at rudders and paddles like the jaws of prehistoric beasts. Boats were built anew, dugout canoes, some so large they needed half a dozen men to steer. They were carved from cedar and fir, the wood fragrant and fibrous, bending not to wish but to skill. With every stroke the Corps became part of the landscape, eyes squinting through mist, muscles taut with the strain of keeping vessel and life upright. Sacagawea, ever steady and seldom idle, would sit in the prow with Jean-Baptiste wrapped against her breast in otter fur, her eyes watching the water with a gaze honed by ancestry. Her presence in the Corps had transformed from symbol to center, as rooted in the journey as the river itself. It was she who could name the flowering shrubs along the sandy banks, who taught the men which roots would cure headache and which would summon fever, which fish to spear and which to ignore. Through her quiet directions or flick of the hand she became a bridge not only to tribes ahead, but to the soul of the land itself. Tribes along this stretch spoke Chinookan, their tongues curling around words with slow grace, like driftwood circling an eddy. Here cultures were different. The people wore woven cedar bark cloaks that repelled rain, and headdresses adorned with abalone and shells that shimmered even in dusklight. Women ruled inheritances. Totems rose outside longhouses, carved with beaks of ravens, paws of bears, eyes turned toward storm-laced oceans. These were coastal people, made of tide and tree, and they marveled at the pale invaders not with nervous curiosity, as tribes on the plains had, but with a measured dignity. The Corps had stories. These people had oceans. Gifts were exchanged, blue beads, red cloth, mirrored trinkets, and medals bearing Jefferson's face. In return came carved paddles, fish, bark mats, and smoked salmon packed into woven bags. The Chinooks traded not only goods but guidance. There lay the last falls ahead. Beyond them, perhaps only a few days to reach the salt-smelling air. The final weeks brought hardship layered atop weariness. Torrential rains fell daily, and soaked clothing, blankets, guns. Fires hissed out before they could ignite. Lewis, feverish and distant, scrawled by lantern light in his dampened journal, documenting a type of fish scaled in copper and a tribe who painted their faces with coals to mourn the dying year. Clark, practical and restless, led foraging parties and oversaw the delicate surgery of drying powder and preserving bark-wrapped provisions. The men dreamt of dry socks and bread, of home hearths and wives' laughter, visions sharpened by discomfort. The days, once measured in bird sightings and medicine discoveries, were now counted by rapid survived, meals eaten, distance left. And then a moment crystallized in legend. They tasted salt. It clung to the wind. The air, always damp, took on a bite, a sting that curled the nose and coated the lips. Some swore they heard gulls. Others simply stared westward, mouths agape with reverence. And then, suddenly, undeniably, the sea. No romantic sweep of blue spreading endlessly into the heavens as stories told. The Pacific greeted them as a storm-beast, waves colliding with boulders crashing high to kiss the pines. The horizon was gray, ruthless, and eternal. Sea lions rested on slick, algae-covered rocks in the distance. The wind shrieked through the needles, a voice impossible to ignore. The ocean was not welcoming. It tested them immediately with fog, with bitter chill that burned skin raw, with cramps in the fingers from bailing water and setting camp in sodden earth. But awe silenced complaint. Some men wept openly. Others simply sat, staring into the mist, listening to the ancient lullaby of crashing surf and wind that carried no echo. They built Fort Clatsop near the estuary, a crude fort with log walls, a guard post, and damp beds that molded before the first frost. Yet it was shelter. They named it for the nearby Clatsop tribe, whose hunters offered smoked elk and whose artisans helped mend torn moccasins with hide toughened by sea air. The winter that followed settled over them like a heavy quilt of gray. The sky never cleared, or so it seemed, for more than 3 days at a stretch. Rain fell sideways, then straight down, then misted, then raged. Boots never dried. Powder stores jostled with mold. Salt was gathered from boiled seawater. Meals were thin roots, fish, and occasional fowl. Sickness visited but rarely stayed, allergic perhaps to the sheer exhaustion of the men. Journals bore witness to both desolation and wonder. Lewis detailed coastal customs. Whale bones used as structural beams, storage caches hung in trees to deter raccoons, children who played with carved seabirds. Clark recorded latitude and tides with scientific precision, his hand almost mechanical in its drive to chronicle. Dissent simmered, unnoticed but palpable. Some grew disheartened, asking quietly, was it worth it? Would anyone back east believe them? Would their names be remembered, or twisted, buried beneath Jefferson's goals? York found admiration among coastal tribes as he had further inland. His powerful frame and rich skin, the color of river stones after rain, earned him a place of myth, even as his role among the Corps remained laden with inequity. Sacagawea, ever quiet, folded into routine. She became firekeeper and fisherwoman, cook and consoler, all while tending to her child, who now gurgled and rolled among cedar bedding. The men talked of Jean-Baptiste as pomp, and saw in his laughter a kind of innocence no storm could wash away. Still each day dragged like a canoe against an unrelenting current. The precious papers, maps, journals, treaties were stored high and wrapped in oiled skins. Runners were chosen to return ahead in spring, backtrack if storms or conflict delayed the main body. Every man was assigned contingencies. Fort Clatsop became a nest of anxious hope. Nights came early, so dark even the fire dared not rise too high. And as they lay in their bunks, blankets heavy and hearts heavier, the men heard the sea howl, not like a wolf nor like wind, but something older, deeper, a voice from time before time. And it told them, "You have made it, but you are not done." That voice lived in their dreams, dreams of the journey home, which seemed impossibly long now, dreams of returning through lands they barely survived once, dreams of Sacagawea, walking ahead, torch in hand, dreams of Lewis, climbing above fog, reaching a summit, and seeing nothing but rivers, always more rivers, always more. No victory cheers rang that winter, but in the small fort by the mighty Pacific, by the campfire that hissed with sea air, a moment of truth had been planted. They had reached the edge of their world, and it had not ended, but begun again. And so they prepared, weathered, starving and silent, for the long pull eastward, through memory, through mistake, toward that long horizon where destiny has no harbor, only winds. Chapter 6. Longing for Home. The snowmelt raced down the slopes of the Bitterroot Mountains, swelling rivers with the fresh blood of spring. Buds unfolded like careful fingers, and birds flitted through forests newly green. The winding edge of the western world softened as the core of discovery stood once more at the threshold between the wild unknown and the long road back. Muscles, once swollen with frostbite and starvation, now carried the imprint of hardship like scripture carved into skin. The expedition had reached the western sea, stared into the eye of the Pacific storm, and now, with winter behind them, they longed not for glory nor for adventure, but for home. It was Meriwether Lewis who first proposed the division of the Corps. Jefferson's commission demanded not only fulfillment, but innovation, and the return journey would provide the final brushstrokes on maps, the last answers to long-lingering geographical riddles. What lay between the Missouri's upper branches and the Yellowstone? What northern rivers might chart straighter or safer passage in future generations? The decision, though rational and essential, carried the weight of gamble. By splitting into two groups, they doubled their claim but halved their strength. William Clark, calm and resilient as Riverstone, would take half the corps and retrace much of their original route along the Missouri River. He carried with him Sacagawea and her husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, along with their infant son. Clark's route promised fewer surprises, but its familiarity did not mean ease. Mudslides chewed at the banks, and heavy rains returned the land to a drowned silence. Each night Clark penned entries not merely as records, but as fragments of memory to keep the fire of resolve alight. He described birds like old friends returned, morning doves cooing in the morning dew, herons stalking riverbanks aflame with wild iris. Across every page the word home began to recur, not often, not loudly, but with increasing certainty. Lewis, ever the seeker, set forth northeast toward the Marias River, a lesser-known arm of the Missouri that he hoped would fulfill one of Jefferson's dreams, that the territory might stretch all the way into British Canada, extending American land claims further still. He moved with a small detachment of 9 men and a weary sense of splintered time. The joy of discovery no longer burned so brightly. Instead, a strange melancholy pulsed beneath each milestone. The land remained majestic, but less magical now. Peaks rose, rivers split, bison stampeded, just as they had before. But Lewis no longer beheld them with the same fire. Discovery was no longer a promise. It was an obligation. Trouble found them there on the high plains, not through storm or sickness, but through man. Near the Two Medicine River, the group encountered a band of Blackfeet warriors. At first the meeting bore the honeyed trappings of neutrality. Gifts were exchanged, knives, tobacco, peace medals, and shared fires illuminated wary faces. Yet beneath their smiles lay misgivings. The Blackfeet, proud and powerful, learned that Lewis had traded arms with their enemies, the Shoshone and Nez Perce. Their silence stiffened into stillness. Trust, always tenuous between strangers, snapped like brittle grass in the wind. The confrontation erupted with the speed and violence of a lightning strike. In the dark of a sleeping camp, Lewis awoke to a scuffle, the unmistakable clatter of weapons, and the guttural shouts of alarm. In the panic, two Blackfeet warriors attempted to steal rifles. Shots rang out through the choking dawn mist. One warrior fell near the river's edge, his blood curling like ink into the current. Another collapsed beneath a firing fusillade, a look of surprise carved into his quieting face. It was the first bloodshed of the entire expedition, American and native alike. Lewis was shaken not by the necessity of the act, but by the irreversible fracture it represented. What had once been a journey of knowledge and peace had now slipped into darker entanglements. He feared how the story would be told, what legacy would carry this moment downriver through the generations. From there, the expedition unraveled steadily back toward reunion. Lewis's patrol moved at dire speed, as if outrunning guilt itself. Fatigue wore heavy. Wolves howled too close to the camp. Dreams became jagged, filled with broken canoes and unseen arrows in moonless forests. In one journal entry, Lewis scrawled with angry haste, "The land opens yet tightens. It breathes but does not forgive." Meanwhile, Clark followed the meandering Yellowstone, naming landscapes and features for men and memories. Pompey's Tower for Sacagawea's son, the infant whose nighttime gurgles provided strange comfort to men who had not seen a fireplace or woman's touch in over a year. Clark noted waterfalls tumbling like white fabric tossed by unseen hands, cliffs haunted with eagles, and bison roving again in thick herds, stirring the earth as if ancient drums beat beneath their hooves. For Sacagawea, the return opened a quiet ache. She passed within sight of her people's land again, a horizon of familiar shapes and sacred hills. Her brother, Chief Cameawait, had offered welcome months prior, but she had refused to remain. Now she turned away once more, this time by choice. She would not stay with the Shoshone, nor did she yet belong among whites. Like the baby she carried in cradleboard against the rhythm of her heartbeat, she was suspended between worlds, neither native nor conqueror, but bridge and witness. And York, Clark's enslaved companion, was more than just a silent witness to history. Among the tribal nations he was often celebrated and respected, his immense strength and unique appearance drawing both awe and honor. He danced with Mandan warriors beneath constellations, was gifted robes woven from elk sinew, and his laughter echoed across campfires like a new dialect of resilience. Yet even he, who had tasted pure equality under the open sky, felt the weight of return more keenly than most. He knew that civilization so praised by those like Jefferson had little place for a black man molded by liberty and bonded labor. Eventually, in the heat-heavy days of late July, Lewis and Clark reunited on the upper Missouri, a breathless meeting along the river resembling fewer triumphant trumpets and more a weary exhale. There was no ceremony, no grand declaration, only a long silence followed by the clapping of hands on shoulders and a shared meal scraped together from salted fish and unleavened bread. Their first night as a joined party once more, neither man slept. They sat beneath a sky scratched with stars, wrapped in cloaks still damp from river spray, and spoke less of maps and more of men lost. Sergeant Charles Floyd, the only casualty in those long years, and the countless unnamed native guides forgotten within the folds of legend. They recalled the sound of prairie grass and wind, the black arc of buffalo migrations, the face of Sacagawea when she first spotted the mountains of her childhood. They tried not to think of the future, not of what kind of world they would return to, or whether that world had a place for the people they had become. Still, in the days that followed, the river pulled them eastward. Towns awaited, questions awaited, Jefferson awaited. The core of discovery floated forward, past cottonwood groves shimmering silver green, through fields humming again with crickets and swallows. One night, a storm boomed high overhead, a closing movement of thunder and rain, and not one man stirred from his bedroll. They had known storms darker still. On the final stretch, as the Mississippi curled into view, the men turned to each other often, saying little, just listening to the lap of water, to the rise and fall of breath, to the hush that only those who've left everything behind and returned can share. And in that silence lived a truth deeper than the river. No one who sets out into the great unknown ever truly returns unchained. Chapter 7. The Return to Civilization. The day began with the air heavy with the scent of midsummer blooms, and the earth damp beneath leather-worn boots. After more than 2 years in the wilderness, having braved mountains that clawed at the sky and rivers that whispered both welcome and threat, the core of discovery finally saw the neat outlines of farmland where once there had only been endless trees. They followed the Missouri like an old friend guiding them home, its bends more familiar now, its moods less wild. The canoes glided through water quieter than memory, and each mile felt like unraveling a dream too vivid to forget. The sound of axes in the distance, the chopping of civilization, was like thunder in unfamiliar rhythm. Eyes that had seen the shimmer of Pacific tides and the solemn gaze of grizzlies returned now to fences and shingles. The men stood atop riverbanks looking at settlements with the silent disbelief of those caught between worlds. Once a world had stretched uncharted before them like scripture waiting for its first words. Now churches marked the horizon and smoke curled peacefully from chimneys. They arrived at St. Louis on a late summer afternoon. The first sight of townspeople was surreal. Word had not preceded them adequately. These hardened men, leathered from sun and ice, their beards rich with the stories of the continent, were met not with parades, but stunned silence. Who were these figures returning from the myth? The expedition had slipped into ghosthood in memory, dead, perhaps lost. As townspeople recognized their names, awe unfurled like flags catching wind. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, men removed their hats, and steamboat crews let out 3 cheers. A single cannon blast later, and the city pulsed with life. Dignitaries arrived with silver cups and folded letters of welcome. A clergyman stepped forward to bless the returned, and a local schoolteacher choked back emotion as she addressed the children. These are the men who walked where no white man had walked before. Langdon, a blacksmith who had moved from Virginia in hopes of frontier fortune, wept openly upon seeing York, a black man held in awe by many tribes, now returned to a world where his name was still chained. Little changed for York. Though heralded as a helper of kings in the wilderness, civilization coiled around him again like cold iron, its weight unshaken even by 2 years of glory. The men of the Corps, Sergeant Ordway, Private Shields, Drouillard, Charbonneau, found themselves disoriented in their own country. Some were handed coins as rewards, certain land titles for service, but none of the gifts matched the vastness of what lay behind them. No medal could replicate the sound of elk crashing through underbrush in the Montana dusk. No monument could capture the feeling of Sacagawea clutching her child as the first imperial thunder of the Pacific filled her eyes. Lewis withdrew early from the celebrations. Even amid the welcoming cries, he walked as if still on the trail, steps compulsively even, eyes darting like he expected wolves in the crowd. In the governor's chambers he sat across from President Jefferson himself, a painted portrait of calm, but bearing the weight of storms no canvas could hold. Jefferson pressed eagerly for detail. The president's quill danced as Lewis spoke. Geologic formations, tribes encountered, unfamiliar fauna, unbroken forests, maps unfurled across offices lined with books, and the president's fingers followed the tracing of rivers as if holding the bones of fate itself. He listened not only as a leader but as a scientist, thrilled with the promise of the age of reason. Yet even he could not fathom all that had been sacrificed to define those winding lines of ink. Meriwether Lewis was promoted, declared governor of Upper Louisiana, appointed with fanfare, welcomed with speeches, garlanded with titles, but he wore power like a borrowed coat. His journals became slower, less radiant. Somewhere between the Rocky Mountains and Washington's polished desks, the pulse of purpose had faded. He smiled less, often gazing not at others but toward that distant, ungoverned frontier of the past. Where Lewis drifted into solitude, Clark bore the burden of statesmanship with a steady, if sometimes hesitant, hand. True to his nature as both builder and pathfinder, Clark found a measure of peace in fatherhood and familiarity. He adopted Sacagawea's son, Jean-Baptiste, promising him education and opportunity. And though Sacagawea herself would not be long for the world, her tracks would soon vanish into historical shadow. Her name lingered in the hearts of those who had followed her through mountain passes and eagle-infested skies. Among the common folk, the Corps became the stuff of fireside tales. Taverns buzzed with stories of men who faced beasts larger than oxen and rivers that hissed in winter. In letters and broadsheets, they were etched into the national consciousness not as men of flesh and blood, but as avatars of American ingenuity and determination. But even glory has its shadows. Many of the men, once paid and thanked, drifted into obscurity. They returned to farms too fallow, fields altered by wind and years. The weight of life without daily purpose gnawed at them. Some married quickly, hoping to root themselves into the earth again. Others found peace harder to come by. The explorer Drouillard returned to the wild, seeking refuge in the solitude of fur trading. The Shoshone woman's name echoed quietly, reverently, especially among those who had traveled beside her. York, despite years of loyal service and heroism that saved lives, was eventually denied his freedom by Clark for years after their return. His laughter among tribes who had danced with him became laughter stilled in service once more. Lewis, meanwhile, moved frequently between cities and shadows. Rumors rolled quietly across parlors that the explorer whose notes had once captured the complexity of a continent could no longer find sleep in night or peace in day. The very knowledge he carried weighed like storm clouds over the soul. He drank more, wrote less. His staff often found him staring at moths fluttering against candlelight, as though mapping his own doubts in their flickering wings. He took to long walks, sometimes disappearing for days. In 1809 he departed on a journey toward Nashville, through the solitude of the Natchez Trace. There, in a roadside inn, they found him, his body torn by gunfire. Whether enemies caught him or despair did, no one could say with certainty. He was 35. The man who once stared down grizzlies and demanded safe passage from towering war chiefs had perished in a rented room, far from rivers, from lost maps, from the whisper of unknown trees. His death shook the surviving corps. For Clark, it carved a trench of silence inside him that even time could not fill. He named his son Meriwether Lewis Clark, and often spoke of the journey only in clipped recollections, as if the full story could ruin any listener. Yet for all the shadows, something golden remained. The notes they left behind, Lewis's careful observations, Clark's precise maps, became more than data. They became legacied. Seeds for future expeditions, for railroads that would one day follow their path, for museums that would preserve their words in glass and leather. In schoolhouses tucked into valleys they had once crossed unseen, children learned of towering peaks with native names, of star maps used to find direction, of friendships forged through hardship, of human beings stepping into wildness not with conquest, but with awe. And even as towns grew over once silent plains, there remained, between page and memory, between the Columbia's whisper and the Missouri's slow song, a thrum of something sacred. Home had welcomed them, but the wilderness, once entered, never quite let them go. Chapter 8. The Shadow of Solitude. The city no longer whispered like the wind in the plains. It clanged, it boomed, hooves rang on cobblestones, shopkeepers hollered beneath wooden beams, and the smell of ink and whiskey lingered in every ledger-laden room. For Meriwether Lewis, these sounds were neither comforting nor celebratory, but foreign and far too loud. Since returning from the great journey across the continent, he had found himself increasingly unmoored, adrift not on water, but in time, in thought, in expectation. Honor lined the streets in banners and accolades. Young boys played at explorers with twigs for rifles, pretending to map streams beside their homes. Newspapers named Lewis a modern Odysseus, a conqueror of rivers and wilderness. And yet each article, each bouquet of praise only deepened the weight in his chest. In St. Louis, where he had been appointed governor of the upper Louisiana Territory, Lewis tried to bury his disquiet beneath paperwork and politics. He took his place among polished desks and wax-sealed letters, where individuals in waistcoats argued over land parcels they had never so much as smelled after a summer rain. Gone were the raw lungs of wilderness, the sacred hush of the Rockies, the eruption of salmon along the Columbia. Now there was only ink and policies and the pale eyes of bureaucrats with expectations as heavy as wet wool. His journals, once alive with wonder and pain, species classifications, river flow calibrations, and night sky recollections, now sat unopened. They gathered dust in locked trunks. He had meant to finish organizing them, to polish narrative into testament, but each time he sat before the pages, he felt an ache of strange betrayal. Those entries were not just notes, they were his memory stones, proof of something holy, something that had mattered. Now they seemed relics of a man he no longer understood, or perhaps no longer was. His hand trembled when he held a quill. Words would not come. Sometimes he stared at the page for hours, his breath barely rising in his chest. He wondered if the wilderness had given him life, or if it had stolen something essential from him during those frozen nights near the Bitterroots, something he could never retrieve. Letters came often from Jefferson, still fond, still fatherly, but lined with growing urgency. Where were the finalized reports? Where was the proof, the comprehensive charts, the catalog of findings the young nation had banked upon? Lewis had spent nearly 20 months crossing the continent. He had pulled men back from the brink of hunger, revolt, and battle. He had charted a land no white man had yet described, had touched the Pacific with feet that bled and spirit that roared. Yet the Republic's appetite grew more ferocious. Discovery was never enough. It wanted recording. It wanted summary. It wanted usefulness. Night was the least forgiving of all. It pressed close and quiet around him, not like the wide sky nights of the prairie or the breathing dusk by the Missouri. Speech boys. It's his soners that man's being real. There's when Jim might be tame. Near Compton. To me up. All the catch can't help. What do you know to it in the pan? And even I night news. Ducks and was. So what is in props? So let us fight. Why you out? What come on? Somebody. He told her. Some of that. All bravo. Some of the things like this pops is response to support. With some red dot being security, we sold it. And you stay as the celebrates like when it is just now past his neck. The question to well result brings them back for it. If the rest of the opposite places thought about the no, but think this thing shall also point up all the stuff. I did it. Only that is the just like of York dancing in the night fires with Mandan children draped upon his shoulders. Of Sacagawea crossing terrain with her son pressed close, her expression unreadable yet firm. Of Clark's voice calling across snowdrifts. He woke shouting, sometimes weeping. And then came the debts. Supplies promised by the War Department were delayed. Expenses incurred during the expedition had yet to be reimbursed. Documentation was insufficient. Lewis appealed, again and again, to Washington, to Jefferson, to new intermediaries. But the answers were slow, cold, as if the continent walk had been a fairy tale, unfounded in ledgers. Ironically, the land he had helped map with sweat and blood slowly turned against him in bureaucracy, paper trails, and mounting suspicion. Some even suggested impropitious use of funds. Audits loomed. On the morning of September 3, 1809, seeking clarity, support, and the will to finalize his expedition journals, Lewis set out alone toward Washington by way of the Natchez Trace, carrying with him drafts of his writings, vouchers to validate his claims, and letters for political allies. What roads could not steal from him? Isolation did. Autumn thickened the trees. The Trace, a path once trodden by traders and travelers, lay quiet beneath towering oaks, already frost-brittled. Each footstep echoed not toward purpose, but into something deeper, folded in silence. The man who had navigated canyons now slept rough in abandoned inns. He found little kindness in stopping houses. His nerves flared. He muttered curses at shadows, sometimes speaking to companions not present, Clark, Jefferson, even Seaman, his long-lost Newfoundland dog. He had once boasted, half honestly, that he could read the stars. Now, even in moonlight, he could no longer name the constellations. Of the final night, in a tavern far from any attention history deems fully clear, only echoes remain. What can be said is this. When morning came to that outpost near Hohenwald, Tennessee, the body of Meriwether Lewis lay in his chamber, shot through twice, once in the stomach, once in the head. He had, in his last days, been heard to speak of failure, not failure of mission, but of meaning, of not being seen, not being understood. Rumors swirled immediately. Some swore it was suicide. Others whispered murder for debts unpaid, papers stolen, or vengeance for unspoken words. The governor's body was buried nearby in a simple grave along the same trace he had ridden westward years earlier in shining hope. Thomas Jefferson mourned deeply. He called Lewis of courage undaunted. William Clark, upon hearing the news of his friend's death, penned not just public tribute, but private grief. In the margins of his journal, he wrote, "I wish I had seen him again, our brother of the wilderness." But history, relentless as a riverbed current, churned on. In politics, new names rose, young men who had not crossed a continent but claimed it nonetheless. Newspapers moved on to wars and territories, to railroads, crops, and continental ambitions. And yet Lewis's shadow never truly left. For beneath each westward wind, among every class of school children learning maps traced from his hand, in the hush of pine forests now cleared for timber, the echo lingered. A man had walked from the edge of kin into the breath of another ocean. He had documented unfamiliar stars. He had risked ambush and madness in the name of understanding. And when he returned, his wounds were not praised, but pressed. His discoveries commissioned, but his soul ignored. Some say Lewis was only a wanderer, not made to settle in rooms with doors. Others say he was the very spirit of the American search, a bright spark that knew no resting place. But in the end, his final journey was inward into the unwritten, a passage not of rivers, but of shadow. Still, the land remembers. Our Chapter 9. The Legacy River. Early, night settled upon the vast plains, once wound by canoes and soft moccasin steps, and somewhere a river continued to murmur beneath moonlight, unseen but not forgotten. Across the continent the names Lewis and Clark had become etched onto schoolhouse walls, folded into bedtime lore, sung in songs lilting under the breath of history like prairie wind through tall grass. But behind those names pulsed a deeper stream, one not wholly contained in textbooks or glorified in brass statues. It was the river of their legacy, winding through generations, ephemeral and eternal all at once. The journals they carried with bleeding fingers and ink smudged by rain still breathed. Every line penned with frost-bitten hands had become more than observation. It was testimony, each plant drawn, each latitude notched into weather-cracked pages, each sentence recording a cry in the wild, was part of a long confession to the unknown, a letter to posterity, sealed with sweat instead of wax. In libraries lined with oak shelves, those journals would lie patiently for the next hands to open them. Children with wide eyes traced the sketches of buffalo and unfamiliar stars, and old historians touched the margins with reverence, deciphering what the captains had meant by phrases like "remarkable encounter" or "one man gravely ill." The subtleties of fear were still there, hidden behind Jeffersonian language like pewter glints beneath river mud. But no legacy flows without turbulence. As the United States expanded westward, pushing railways where trails had once meandered like curious serpents, the narrative of discovery was polished until it gleamed. The costs were buffed away, yet they persisted for those who listened with more than curiosity. Tribes once approached with medals and mirrors found themselves cast as obstacles in a nation's ascent. The handshake once offered by Lewis and Clark was not upheld by those who came after. The symbols had been exchanged, but not the soul of the promise. Children of the Mandan, Nez Perce, and Shoshone remembered different stories. Elders spoke in half-shadowed runes about white men who came with eyes full of stars and hands too full of tools. There had been peace, yes, but also suspicion. Generosity, yes, but also appropriation. These were not contradictions, but the truth's twin edges. In their campfires, whispers still carried names: Lewis, Clark, York, Sacagawea. Revered by some, questioned by others, but never forgotten. Myths evolve, but footprints remain. Of the woman called Sacagawea, her legacy walked far beyond the trails she traveled. She became emblem, spirit, mother, cartographer of emotion in a world where direction was often determined not by compass but by courage. Her calm presence among armed soldiers was not simply one of guidance, it was resistance in skin and braid in cradle-bound child. Her image now adorned stamps, statues, even coinage. But what would the real Sacagawea have thought, riding silent between honor and overuse? Some say she lived a long life, others say her journey ended early. Historians argue, but memory is not confined to headstones. She lives still in every girl who wonders if her voice can turn strangers into allies, every quiet soul who leads not by command, but by being simply and powerfully present. And beside her, still in spirit and smoke, walked York. Of all the men on that monumental journey, York's name whispered through the legacy like river reeds catching the wind, obvious only to those who leaned close. A man who bore the weight of bondage as he paddled upstream, who danced with tribes who saw not a servant, but a god. While America debated whether a black man could lead, York led with laughter, with stories, with strength that won admiration not only from his fellow explorers, but from peoples long persecuted by the notion of race. Did York gain his freedom after returning to civilization? Accounts differ. Some say Clark freed him years later. Others report York dying angry and disillusioned in Kentucky. And yet another tale, no less probable, claims he returned west, vanished into tribal lands, and lived among those who respected him as a brother, not property. Sometimes history loses track of its truest moments. Still, every descendant who claims York as an ancestor carries something more than blood. They carry the echo of his footprints pressing westward, not in service, but in determination. His legacy is stitched into the boughs of cottonwood, and the glint in the eye of every soul who dares more than they are allowed. And what of the captains? For Clark, legacy lived on in law. As Indian agent, he danced the strange waltz between diplomacy and domination. He helped negotiate treaties, some fair, many dire. He kept maps, raised a family, and trained others to traverse landscapes he once crossed with aching boots. His house became a museum of days he had once lived under canvas and stars. For Lewis, legacy was heavier, darker. Songs sang of his bravery, artists painted him, beginning heroic dialogues with mountains. Monuments rose bearing his name, but few paused to consider the cost he carried. Depression was not yet understood in his day. The silence in his later writings was mistaken for idleness, the tremor in his thoughts interpreted as sin rather than suffering. He had gazed into the uninhabited vastness only to bring back a knowledge perhaps too grand for the world eager to exploit it. That he died alone, whether by hand or fate, only deepened the mystery, but it did not diminish his measure. Even now he rides the dreams of the mournful and the daring, cigarette smoke curling in late-night taverns where adventurers still gather to murmur, "What do we seek, if not what they sought?" In schools, children build papier-mâché models of canoes. In museum corridors, the expedition is lined out with dioramas and domed glass maps, arrows pointing west as if beckoning us still. But there are teachers who lean down to whisper between the lines. They speak of a journey not just in leagues and latitudes, but in learning and loss. They tell of a continent not discovered but encountered, of peoples met, not conquered, of nature not as conquest to be won, but as a choir to be heard. They speak of mistakes made, of bravery flawed. They teach not just the destination, but the decisions. And so the river goes on. Sometimes you hear it in the hush between tides. Sometimes in the turning of a page, sometimes in the naming of a child. The push west may have stopped with the ocean, but the voyage inward that still sends rafts of wonder drifting through the soul, through glen and gorge, through story and silence. The legacy of the Lewis and Clark expedition endures not because of what they found, but because of what they tried to see. In every effort to understand, to map, to connect, they left behind not a history, but a hymn. It is a hymn hummed now not only by Americans, but by all who have taken uncertain paths, seeking only the horizon. So listen, careful now. There's a rustle there, outside your window, just beyond the last page. A river, still flowing, still calling names upstream. H3